Thank you again for coming. And I know that this morning's topic has been something that a lot of you have been looking forward to, because since February, we have had, in our church, we've had 2 co-lead pastors. And some of you have been flummoxed, perhaps confused, but no less than these 2. So, anyway, so they're here to chat a little bit about what it means to be co-leaders, what's working, what isn't working, what it all means as far as where we're going as a church. And there'll be opportunities at the end before lunchtime for Q&A, so if they know anything good for them, they'll go to about 5 till 12. Questions are short and sweet, but that was just note to the wise. So. Okay, let me pray, and then we'll get going. God, thank you that you send gifted and awesome people to be leaders in our churches. And we thank you, Father, for both Jeff and Shawn as they have come to be co-lead pastors here at WMB. We ask God for just your blessing on our time together, and may we not only be informed, but also may you develop enthusiasm and excitement for what you have been doing, what you are doing, what you will do. In Jesus' name, amen.
I thought he was going to say 2 dashingly handsome, young men. All right. Oh, I'm spilling water now. You can take the lead, Shawn.
So WB has always said from the beginning of this journey that we're trying something new. And it's something that there's not really a roadmap for, neither here or really at very many churches at all. In fact, Jeff and I get some pastors who kind of occasionally will ask us, like, what does this look like? What does it mean? And we are kind of sharing with them and also saying, we're still figuring it out a bit too. What WB realized was that this is a large church with a large staff, and the demands on a single individual were challenging. And so they wanted to do a better job of opening that into not only because it would be 2 people, but because it would be a collaborative and more of a team-based model. And there were some ground rules, but there was a lot of discussion in the early days, and even continuing to say, we're going to work it out as we kind of go along and we see what works and what doesn't work. And so, we've only been about 6 months into this, so we're still figuring it out too. And we're also dealing with, where we've been and where we want to move towards. So that's kind of all of the formula that sort of went into where we are today. Traditionally in churches, there's very often either a lead pastor, or some churches have a teaching and vision type of pastor, and some other sort of executive operations type of pastor. And again, WB's leadership said, we don't want to do that. We don't want to choose either of those models, but we'd like to choose a model that's more collaborative, more based on giftings, and more suitable to overseeing is the right word, a complex and dynamic congregation, kind of like WB, especially one with 2 sites, which is another aspect that is unique in some senses to WB. So when we were in the process of coming, and offering to be interviewed and to consider the role, it was kind of a big, like, who's this other guy going to be? Or person, who's this other person going to be? And because we knew that to facilitate a collaborative model like that, it was going to take some camaraderie and some chemistry and some ability to kind of know and trust and hold together. Like, you need to know that, like, when Jeff and I, like, you may see one name or another, but we are constantly in conversation with one another, and we have each other's backs. We have some procedures in place to what do we do if we don't have each other's backs, but so far it's been very easy to have each other's backs and to be charting kind of these next steps together. So we do have a division of responsibilities, and that kind of guides both the work that we do, Monday to Friday. Yes, we do work more than 1 day a week. And it also kind of guides who we are responsible for within the organization in terms of oversight and supervision. But again, so much of this is together work. We really don't lead separately. Yes, maybe some particular meetings or some particular individual one-on-ones where we kind of split and work on our own areas, but a lot of this stuff we do together. So, and that can be time-consuming, but it's really brilliant. It really is nice to have a partner in this who I can bounce ideas off of, collaborate with, think together, who might catch me if I say something silly, that kind of stuff. So that's sort of a little bit of the groundwork of how we got here. What's really neat is Jeff and I are different people. I know we kind of look the same sometimes, but Jeff has some different skills. He's been a lead pastor in a church longer than me. He's got some more gifting in operations areas and in sort of what you might say is that traditional executive pastor role. I don't know if he loves all of that stuff.
Not at all.
Most pastors are. That's a tough one. But it's a really interesting way to say, we don't just want to pigeonhole you into these things that we think, need to be done, and they do need to be done, but who are you? How are you gifted? And how can we best release that for the life of the church? Good time to show the picture. You have something else to add?
Yeah, so the way that the search committee, did an array of interviews with multiple individuals and worked through kind of, where we're looking for similar giftings in certain areas and different giftings in separate areas. And so there's these shared responsibilities and then individual responsibilities. And so what they presented to us, we will share with you, if Adam could put it up on the screen. There we go. So, I'm going to stand up so I can see it, because I don't remember. That's really blurry.
There it is.
Okay, so you see the green, now it's on this, the middle column, it's actually two distinct colors. So Shawn, co-lead pastor, there's yellow, and you'll see yellow under pastoral care, age-based ministries, worship and arts. And so those are the specific areas that are individual responsibilities for Shawn. And then with myself in the blue, Barnabas and missions, finance operations, Kitchener site pastor, outreach and community partnerships are the specific individual responsibilities for myself. And then the two green ones, preaching planning team. Shawn is the lead of the preaching planning team, but it's a shared responsibility. And so the way that they work that out is we work as a preaching team as opposed to one or two individual preachers. And so Shawn leads that team and then works on schedules and different things like that. But then we collaborate in the midst of it. So as we're building, where are we going next, what are we doing, things like that. Shawn is very gifted at gathering conversational pieces. So as we meet as a team and talk about what's next and things like that, Shawn is really good at capturing all of that and sort of building it into a guiding chart that allows us to kind of move forward into a sermon series. Where I'm a little bit, my brain's a little bit more scattered when it comes to some of that kind of stuff, and so lots of ideas. But I'm used to being a lead pastor who runs with it on his own, because I would preach, 45, 46 times a year out of 52 weeks, right? And so you didn't have to collaborate. Well, collaboration when it comes to preaching means way more time, way more effort. But I think leads to better results and less burnout. And so Shawn leads that team, and then you'll see as we roll out into the fall, I play a role in the teaching side of things. And so I teach in seminary and all of that kind of stuff, and so you'll be getting some of those, not so much seminary courses, I won't force that on you. But taking some seminary type things and sort of moving it into really practical areas that we can study in Scripture with the Bible. And so I'll be doing some of that, and Shawn will be doing some of that too. So in a shared piece, we have roles that we play within the shared piece because of giftings, but then it's constantly collaborative and working together. And so you'll see on my side, preaching planning team participant, so I'm on that team, but then / teacher, and so that's more of the midweek type of stuff. And then LB leadership committee engagement, so that's working with the board, leadership board, SLT oversight and vision, and strategy / multi-site are shared responsibilities. One of the complexities that Shawn talked about, I think is really important to highlight in this, as my phone's ringing, is really important to highlight in the midst of all of this, is that we are a multi-site church. And I think folks are having a bit of a hard time actually grasping the concept of a multi-site church. So there's times where Shawn may be preaching here and I may be preaching in Kitchener, or vice versa, or hosting. So we have hosts, we have preachers, we have different layers of involvement within the service. And so one of the sort of trends has been, oh, have you been off on holidays? And you're like, nope. I was in Kitchener, or I was in Waterloo, or, those types of things. And occasionally we will also go and preach at other churches or at camps, or we do get a fair amount of requests to go and share with other people within our denomination, and so on and so forth. And myself, working with the Ontario board and Faith and Life team and all of those kinds of things, I'll get pulled into some of those directions. And with some speaking things as well there. And so the board has given us some layers of ability to be able to go and do denominational, like teaching at camp and things like that. Is this the first time you've ever seen this bubble thing? Yeah. Now, keep in mind that this is the preliminary picture. So this isn't like in stone. It's not something like, it's not like the search committee was like, we figured it all out. We basically were tasked to, here's your structure of what we're seeing. Do you guys agree with the breakups? We did. Shawn and I met quite extensively over that. But then as we move into this, we'll start to sift through it and see how it's all working out.
Something else that plays into a lot of this, and where we've been in 6 months, is sort of the transitional trajectory that we had moved through and are still moving through in many ways. So, 2 years ago or whatever, it's been almost 2 years, I think, we had a lead pastor who preached a very large percentage of the weekly messages in both locations. And that was something that when we first entered into multi-site, I can go back in time and remember, we said very specifically, that's not sustainable. It's not going to work in the long term. It's going to lead to burnout. It's going to be a problem. And where our team was and where our sites were at that time, that was the best model for things to move forward, given where we were at. We knew very likely that, having a video site at Kitchener, many other churches that have multi-site churches have a video speaker in one of the or more of the sites, and we felt like that wasn't really going to honor our Kitchener friends, and that was going to be a deal breaker in many ways if that was how we were going to merge. So we knew we had a problem. We were trying something to make it work. I did it once. I drove between the two sites and preached all 3 services. I think it was the last message before COVID blew everything up. And I can tell you, I was exhausted at the end of the morning. And that's just the Sunday morning piece. Kind of the other part of the picture is, Jeff mentioned being in academia, and I finished a master's not too long ago. Writing a message is very much like writing a term paper every single week. It takes a tremendous amount of hours, and it's not just the hours of writing it and preparing it and presenting it, but it's also the background work. We want to read commentaries and books, and we want to be praying. I mentioned this week with our board, step 1 in writing a message is, Lord, I need the message. I can't do this. Give me your word for your people, right? So all of that stuff does take time, and we've seen statistically, anecdotally, throughout many, many churches, pastors who preach a high percentage of their messages week after week after week in churches almost consistently leads to a pretty strong burnout, and then they move on. And often they can move on because they can take their package of messages and move it somewhere else and re-preach them or readapt
Never
them.
done that.
No. I don't have the privilege of that yet. I'm at a point in my preaching career where I'm still working through the first round through all those messages. So, and you know, that adds to the time of it too. And so the board knew that. And what's really beautiful, one of the things that you know, I'm coming to understand in my almost 7 years here, WMB's always been an innovator in a lot of roles and a lot of their leadership ideas. And so it's really great to be able to grow and develop, you know, here with my family. And I'm grateful for a partner who can add to that and to contribute to that. And this collaborative preaching model, you might say, well, that's kind of sounds maybe kind of clunky or it takes more time. Yeah, but we're growing together. And we've got a wonderfully talented staff. Let me tell you, you're so fortunate. You know, I hope you know it. Go visit another church, or well, don't do that. But I'm telling you, we have a wonderful staff. We're very fortunate here with some very gifted individuals, and we've got to continue to grow our entire staff and to release more and more for each of them into their growing in their gifts and ministry. Yeah. So, you know, we want to make use of Brad, and we want to make use of Derek and Renee, and we want to make use of Adam and Michelle, and isn't it great Gareth can still play the guitar? So, you know, we get it sometimes where you might say we'd love to hear Shawn or Jeff more, but we also want to honor the fact that we've got a great bunch of staff who we want to contribute as well, and we want to share their voices with you as well.
Yeah.
So there's lots to that.
There's some practical pieces too. So this wasn't like a decision that was just made based on workload. The traveling back and forth, like the board talked to people, and the feedback was the lack of relationship. So when a preaching pastor comes in, swoops in, you know, flies into the parking lot because they're in between services. So they would preach here, then drive to Kitchener, preach there, then jump back in the car to drive back here to preach here again. And so there was no way for any sort of relationship because it was kind of like preach, thanks, goodbye, and off to the next preaching session. And that really isn't healthy for a church. So if we're going to develop both sites and pastor both sites well, that really, there's a lot of wisdom in not doing it that way. And then the camera adds 10 pounds and we don't want to look at each other. And so video is just not going to work.
You might, you know, this is the tricky thing about preaching. You might feel that you know us, because when we share in our messages, you know, I'm telling a story about my wife or my kids or my cat, or, you know, I love baseball, that kind of stuff. You get a little bit of an inside track on our lives, which is awesome. But if we're flying in and out, and we're not having conversations in the foyer, we're not meeting with you for some coffee, and we're not just stuck in meetings all day, you know, I don't know your name. I don't know your story. I don't know what's going on in your life. So I don't know if I'm preaching a message that's completely oblivious to the fact that this week you've had a terminal diagnosis or some, you know, event in your life that is going to make it harder for that message to hit home with you or to be relevant to you. And we want that. We want to be in the community. We want to know you. We want to be a part of your lives. That is being the church, being the body of Christ together. I'll preach on that on Sunday, so stay tuned.
He's trying to sermon on that. Yeah, so there is just sort of layers of complexity here, multi-site layers, the planning behind the scenes, often, and I've experienced this as a lead pastor in other churches, where you're just expected to be gifted at everything. You're just expected, you're all of a sudden you have an MBA and you're supposed to manage finances and you have a, you know, and we're often just like theologians, right? Like we studied the Bible. And the other day, I was doing sound, and I'm like, we should start a seminary course on tech because pastors are supposed to know that too.
Look at that.
You know, yeah, look who's back at the tech right now. Like, so it is an interesting world that we live in as pastors because often those expectations are there. In smaller church settings, the pastor becomes a practitioner of all things. And to be honest, some do that well, but very few do that well, right? And so WMB has the privilege of being larger and being able to look at things a little bit differently. But there's always that pull to wanting it back that way, right? And so one of the complexities that I've found is I think Kitchener has a bit less confusion, the Kitchener site, around this, because they have a site pastor named Adam. And so Kitchener's kind of like, we know who our pastor is. It's Pastor Adam. And then these guys come, and it's nice to see them, and they pastor us too. But like Adam is generally in the thick of the daily crunch of what is happening at the Kitchener site. Where in Waterloo, you've got this big team that has all these different portfolios, and you hear from different preachers and so on and so forth. And so I think that is something that we're constantly dialoguing about, of how do we create an understanding, you know, if you were to say, who's your pastor? It's all of us. We have a pastoral team. It's not one individual or even just two individuals. You're blessed with a team of gifted people who truly love you, who communicate to us. Like, we rely on the team to be able to communicate things like diagnoses and different things that are happening. And so we're often, not always, but often very good in the loop of things, but then mobilizing staff to help in those different areas. And so we do get that there is this sort of elephant in the room, so to speak, especially here in Waterloo, I think, of kind of like, well, you know, one minute we see Greg, then we see, you know, Shawn and Jeff, and so on and so forth. The other piece that you alluded to is part of our role also as senior leaders in the church is to develop other leaders. Like, we need future preachers, right? So we need to pour into Brad and to Derek, and the only way for them to learn to communicate well is to communicate. And so if they're never given opportunities to communicate to the broader congregation, if we only segregate them into only communicating to teenagers or only communicating to kids, what do they do when they're moving into the next step of their ministry areas? I mean, some will stay in youth and children forever, and others are called into other avenues of ministry. And so we see those giftings, especially in those two, and we want to pour into that. And then we have senior leaders who also need to be given the opportunity to communicate. And so we get the tension. Like, we get it. We see it. We understand it. And the reality in church world is, you know, you'll probably pick your favorites and do all those sort of things. And I feel bad for Shawn about that. But
So you still like me after Sunday?
yeah, and then I do the next Sunday. Like me. So
There's something else that's there. Like, we're talking about some of only the forward-facing stuff. You know, the preaching, the ministries, those kinds of things. And you know, and we'll all say, hey, some of that's been tough in COVID. It's had some ups and downs, and it's pretty exciting to see us moving into this new normal. It feels like a more normal September, and you know, we'll continue to pray that God removes this virus from us and keeps us safe. But you know, it's exciting to see a lot of things really starting to churn again. But you need to know, and again, statistically and going to the background, a lot of pastors are hurting in over this last couple of years. They felt alone. A lot of the times their ministry whole mindset's been thrown upside down. They don't know how to do programs. You know, all the things that they've poured their lives into has been kind of messed with. And so there's a lot of depression, there's been a lot of transience in pastors, there's been a whole bunch of churches looking for pastors, let me tell you. And, that's not different in the corporate world, but it is a season where we've realized in our transition from Chris, and in our last year and a half, 2 years, whatever it's been, we've had to do a lot of work with our staff team to continue to move together and move forward. And so, some of that stuff is healing hurts, and some of that is just caring for the well-being of our staff team. But just know that's been a pretty significant piece, and we've tried to we're changing a kind of a really core piece of how we run and how we see the church. I'm not going to say this with judgment or anything, don't hear that, but there's been a lot of professional ministry here at WB. And when I read scripture and look at the role of a pastor leader, it's to equip and to encourage and to oversee, but to shepherd and to lead others, and not to just be the primary, I can do it kind of person. Because the last time I checked, you're all gifted, you're all empowered by the Spirit of God, and so we all have spiritual sacrifices to offer to this body. I'm testing my message again. I'm going to challenge you. It's not about just going to church. It's about being the church. Right? So we know that there's been times where churches, not just WB, have been, we want to get people in, we want to give them a great show, and then we hope for the best after that. And we are calling people to a greater level of participation, not just in our services, but in how you are transformed before God, how you are living this Christian walk and this following after Jesus Monday to Saturday as well. And so that's led to a bunch of shifts in our ministry. I'll just give you a really practical, personal example. When I was invited here 7 years ago, I was asked to lead every single worship team. And there was some tension in that, because it kind of makes you feel like a celebrity, I'll tell you that. I got it, you can follow me, I know exactly how to do this, and don't worry, I'll never lead you astray. But again, where I kind of go, we've got these other leaders who are very gifted and who will never be able to take that number one position unless we let them. So kind of as soon as the person who gave me that mandate left, I won't name any names, I began to subtly shift that in our worship ministries and said, hey, look, you've got the team. I will support you as your liaison on staff and as your leader, and I can talk to you about vision, and I can talk to you about song choices, and I can mentor you in how to lead the congregation because I've got experience in those areas, but you're it. And that was great, because in that season, the church needed me to fill in more preaching time, and I couldn't lead every Sunday. And now look at that, I'm still filling in more preaching time, and we're working on it. We're getting real close to having a new person who can oversee our worship ministries here in Waterloo. And I will tell you that does take a bunch of time, figuring out schedule and calendar and checking in. And, it's still in my box, so I'm still taking care of that. But we're moving towards a much more lay-run ministry heartbeat around here. So, don't just go to church, but use your spiritual gifts. What does that look like? If you got an idea, if you've got, there's a bunch of our ministries. Our ladies' Bible studies at Great Month started this week. Came from folks who go, we want to do something. There's a history of that at WB, ministries that have been started because somebody goes, I want to do something. Now, we've been guilty sometimes of going, hey, that's a job now. That's probably not going to be the case in the future. We're going to say, hey, you're empowered. How can we support you? So that's a little bit of the behind the scenes piece. There's been a lot of that, working with our staff team, moving us in a new direction, setting our course for the future as well. And so that's some of the behind the scenes stuff that you don't really see every day.
Yeah, essentially we pastor the staff to empower the staff to pastor you. And so we also play a role in that, but it's not possible when you have even 300 people or 400 people. We're not going to know all of those people. It's impossible. Statistically speaking, a single pastorate will often be between 60 to 80 people. because that's what one individual pastor can manage. And there's all kinds of studies that have been done on this. And so and your church will only go as far as what can be managed. My experiences at Evergreen, it was one lead pastor, and we had a quarter-time person who looked after youth. But then the church exploded in a good way with people.
I think.
And so when I got there, it was 60, 65, to be frank, seniors sitting in an auditorium. And so pastoring the 60 to 65 people, sure, I could be a deep part of your life and journey with you and so on. But then we grew to 300. And so what do you do now? We've got, went from 2 children to over 100 children on a Sunday morning. What do you do now? Because volunteers were coming to me saying, we quit. We can't do this. We don't even have the space in the building to put these children in. So how do we even do this, right? So all of a sudden, then it became so urgent to look at staff, to look at all of these different things. And so we do have to be mindful of when we look at the demographics of a church and growth and so on and so forth, of how, really it's managed. There's also a whole other side to this. How many people have seen a $2 million organization just magically run itself? Because WMB is in excess, above $2 million a year in revenue, and that needs to be managed. Now, our disposition is that it's not necessarily purely business. I don't have a business degree. I'm not an MBA. I just happen to have run churches in the past. That's why that's in my purview. Because I don't have any education. I've been an executive director. I've been held those positions in organizations before, and just figured my way through it. Learned how to read financial charts and different things like that, but I don't have any background in it. I have an engineering background, but I never actually did it. My dad was an engineer, and he did school twice, because I wouldn't get me to build anything. So I never practiced in engineering. I purely just have education in it. And so you learn these things as you flub your way through it as a pastor who's supposed to know how to do everything. And so for me coming into this setting, so I started actually in a large setting with a youth ministry of over 200 senior highs. And I remember, just to kind of give you a glimpse of what that's like, I had a computer program, this is in the early 2000s, where we had gotten the leaders to take photos of all of the youth, because there's over 200 youth that are coming on a Friday night. And when a parent would call me to talk about their child, I would often have to look them up in the computer system because I had no idea who they were talking about. But yet, I was deeply engaged in many of their lives. But it's literally not possible to be deeply engaged in over 200 people. How many people here have 200 friends that they are deeply engaged with on a daily basis? So Facebook's done some interesting things to us, hasn't it? Right? There's actually been studies on this. 12 to 14 people. That's what the average person is actually deeply connected to. Outside of that, you're only subtly connected to. And so again, it becomes a real challenge. And so we got to try to build systems and do all of those kinds of businessy sort of things to try to know people. A friend of mine was a megachurch pastor, so we're not a megachurch. And a friend of mine was a megachurch pastor, and he used to reflect to me that he would sit in the parking lot as people were flooding in to one of the multiple services, and he would think to himself, I don't know any of these people. But tons of people would come to hear him preach and to do all these different things, right? So how do we find balance in all of that? How do we find our way forward in all of that? That's kind of what WMB is trying to do. So one, we'll make it collaborative. So right now at WMB, no one person is ever making a sole decision. It's always at least 2, often much more than that. Does that slow the process down? Oh yeah. Yeah, I've said to Shawn a couple times, man, this collaborating at times is a real pain because I just want to get going. Like I just want to get moving. So we could just walk in and say, okay, this is what we're doing. But I think the whole kingdom of priests piece of scripture is important to remember. And so we've been tasked to lead and called to lead and put into a structure in ways that we will do that. And we're trying to find our way through what that kind of looks like. And it's not perfect. And there's plenty of times where I'd rather be doing this than this or whatever. But we're all on the same task. We're all trying to do the same thing. So yeah, that's kind of my heart behind it. I was skeptical, like I'll be honest, coming from being a lead pastor, and the framework of how I love to preach. And I'm looking at this going, I'm not going to preach as much as I'm used to preaching. And in some ways, that was like, oh, thank God, I'm not going to preach as much, right? Because the preparatory work and just the angst and the challenges that's to that of preaching, 40-some sermons a year. But then on the other end of things, I was like, but now I get to do it in a team, and I get to get input, and it's been a real blessing to have the team look at your preliminary document and start to give collaborative feedback to that, and so and then that frees me up to not be studying every single week and writing every single week, and so that we can then look at other aspects of the organization. So lately, that's been pastoring the staff, as well as collaboratively moving forward with where are we going next? What does the Lord want for WMB? And so we're working with the board on that, the staff on that, and we're now in a season where we're beginning to roll some of that progressively out.
Jeff, you've done a bunch of work with our Barnabas ministry as well. That's a huge portion of your side of the equation there. You need to know that, like, to do that kind of vision and leading the way work, like it does take a ton of time, like Jeff has said. And so if you go back to sort of our role splits, I kind of got about 3 to 1 on Jeff in terms of what I'm supposed to handle in terms of preaching. But one of the other things we realized was, like, what we kind of surprised the search committee with, or what was decided even before Jeff showed up, was when we went back to having in-person services, this is a year ago, we're going to run both sites at the same time, which is great. But again, it eliminates the ability for one preacher to cover all of the different preaching times. So we doubled the number of required preaching spots, which, we've worked it out. It's been good, but that's been a bit of a math struggle.
So instead of 52, there's 104 sermons, plus Easter and Christmas, right? And so there's 106 sermons that have to be preached in a year here at WMB.
And so the team has been a really great way of helping us to cover that. But it does need a team that you can't just say, hey, one person or even 2 people could cover all of those spots. So that, just part of the equation and math that goes in the background. But I do have a greater percentage in terms of where I'm supposed to be preaching than Jeff. So for example, here in September, I've had, I think, 3 out of the last 4 weeks or whatever, and then I'm going to take a little break. Jeff's going to be on for a couple of weeks there, and Greg's going to pitch in, and we kind of just start the whole cycle all over again. And we're going to do some more focusing on being here at Waterloo, Jeff and I, and we're going to release Adam at the back there and some other folks to really care for our kitchen site. Doesn't mean we're not going to ever be there again. Relax, we'll be there. But we're just going to spend in this fall season where we're launching Envision and we're heading into an AGM, that kind of thing, where we want to share with you some of the direction that the Lord has been leading us in. And I'll see what you want to share about Barnabas. But, we're going to share that with you. And so we want to be here to do that with you in this season. You want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I'm not going to give them the good stuff.
Okay. You got to wait till AGM.
But, so some of my background, I don't know how many people know a ton about my background, but so I have an extensive background in addictions, mental health, things like that, and have run different organizations and agencies. In Hamilton, for instance, I oversaw a men's homeless shelter, 72 beds, a woman's shelter, as well as 6 different addiction programs across the city of Hamilton. I worked on the Poverty Round Table in Hamilton quite extensively. And so the Barnabas fit made a lot of sense for them to stick me into that. But we are in the process of revisioning what Barnabas, what's driving that forward. So honoring the past, but also moving it into a future. And so there will be a shift that you're going to hear about in October, where we're moving into some new things, developing some new things that we see as needs in our community, both in our local community, the church, as well as our community, KW, and that Barnabas actually also becomes a conduit to a way that you can serve. And so not just a concept of missionaries going into a local community and we fund those missionaries and they work in that local community, but actually missionaries working in communities as facilitators to create ways for the church to serve. And so Stephanie, has been working on some philosophies of poverty and how we interact with poverty. I was so excited because I thought I was going to have to blow that whole thing up and explain and take years to explain that actually the way we've navigated poverty for years has caused more damage than it has good. And that here's sort of the studies and the statistics around it, and here's my personal experiences with it, because I've been right in the trenches of it. Homelessness is not what most people think homelessness is, and I know that because I have several friends who are homeless. We actually use the language street involved now, because not all people on the streets are actually homeless. There's different layers to what that looks